Good evening. When I agreed with Alex to give this talk, he said there's only one catch. We need to know the title now. This was in March. So I chose Footprints, thinking it would give me plenty of latitude. But of course, it's never that easy. Footprints are something left behind, and in architecture, they're most clearly seen in the plan. I believe they also manifest in form, volume, materials, tradition, and culture, all of which shape buildings and inform the appropriateness of architecture. However, it seems to me in most conversations today, topics are centered on the future. Topics such as the future now, or the future is now, or what future, or more recently, the edge of tomorrow. So I started to think perhaps I'd chosen a dumb topic for forward-looking young architects. Then I remembered an old Chinese proverb: the future is only the past again, entered through a different gate. In other words, the future is informed by the past. And I think it's a question of how we interpret and reinvent this past, if it needs fixing. How do you appropriate the past without replication? I believe this calls for a continuous process of rethinking and building upon the basis of what is and what if. This may be stating the obvious, but I believe it's worth serious reflection, particularly as we enter what is obviously an age of uncertainty, one that continues to manifest throughout the world in many different forms, whether socioeconomic, race and religion, or geopolitical. Epicenters are changing, together with cultural influences, technology, and climate, all of which have a profound impact on architecture. Diverse currents and vibrant sites of creativity have now emerged at all ends of the globe. Not all roads now lead to Rome. But it's also been said that increasingly cities are becoming the new countries. It's a good debate. And we're often told that self-contained societies and communities are a thing of the past. And there's now an inescapable logic of interdependence brought upon us by the tide of globalization. This is especially relevant in today's world, where many of us live and work in multicultural societies, in which the idea of what is local and universal is intermixing. I believe this is both a blessing and a curse. Of course, there are also factions who oppose this trend. During my time in Asia, can you hear me when I stand up? Thank you. During my time in Asia, I've been fortunate in having many people of like mind and different nationalities pass through our doors. It's largely the result of location, being Singapore, and has brought a high level of energy and cultural diversity to our practice. But during that time, I've also experienced the homogenization of cities throughout Asia, and the differences are becoming sadly superficial. So in today's world, it would be easy to become pessimistic about the future. However, I'm an optimist. You've got to be if you're practicing architecture when you're nearly mid-70s. So on a positive note, I believe that in a state of uncertainty, we become our most creative. It makes space for multiple interpretations. I think designers enjoy the risks of uncertainty. We love the potential of the fuzzy line that separates the possible from the impossible. Dreaming about and exploring realms of the possible and impossible is what we do. And it's almost uncertain in its outcome. At the same time, this calls for reflection on the core values of architecture, identifying why some buildings work and others don't, asking why some spaces feel uplifting and others are miserable. Firmness, commodity, and delight could easily diminish over the next few decades. As the process of architecture accelerates, we can easily be trapped into designing buildings too quickly. An architecture that relies on shape and style, not substance. And I believe, as architects, this will also force us to face the omnipresent choice of being in the business of architecture or practicing architecture as a business. I know it's becoming old hat, but I've spent a good part of my life, my working life, working within the world of Kenneth Frampton's critical regionalism. I prefer to talk simply about building appropriately, with a sense of belonging, and at risk of making myself unpopular, it's perhaps the polar approach to what has been called plonk architecture. A geary here and a geary there. Architecture at home everywhere and nowhere. So I'm sorry to the geary fans. This might sound flippant, but taken literally, it could lead to cities becoming architectural zoos. I've found that spending time in another culture makes one aware of both the similarities and the differences. Beautifully said by the Mexican poet Octavio Paz, who wrote, "The only way to know ourselves is to recognize the otherness in others." So what has this got to do with footprints? Many things. Architecture, in its making, necessarily becomes part of the physical world. Its form can manifest in diverse ways, but ultimately, each building needs to tell its own story. Just as every person has a life of his or her own, each work of architecture has an absolute value, all to itself. I think that more than any other art, architecture takes time. Through affinity, we align ourselves with ideas to which we aspire. They're the necessary points of reference that shape one's thinking on the long journey of architecture, during which we're required to accept, reject, adjust, and react to the diverse web of ideas that combine to influence our collective and individual design attitudes. So how might an architect approach the future? In my practice, I've deliberately chosen a middle ground and have purposefully allowed a reciprocal influence to exist between my allegiance to selected modernist principles and the experience of living and working in diverse cultures. I've also limited the theoretical ambition of our practice to a few qualities I've come to admire in architecture. One of these is exactitude, another is authenticity. Exactitude is attributed to any object, not just architecture, that is constructed with precision, with the right pieces, one which has neither too much or too little of anything, and within which one material pays respect to another. It's tangible, clearly evident when attained, and should not be confused with minimalism. I had to write this part. Within our search for authenticity, we allow each project to clearly identify itself through place, purpose, and material, in the hope that in Asia at least, our modernist approach might be enriched by accommodating the traditions of the East. We have no formal methodology, but strategies have emerged through an informal process that wanders between observation, analysis, and intuition, between local and universal ideas. We allow the uniqueness of each situation to influence our decisions, but we're not constrained by it. And I like to think the most unifying strategy in our work is the plan, the footprint. Plans embody abstract notions of building form and volume. They're the key that unlocks an idea within which tradition lies and cultural continuity can exist. I'm going to take my watch off because I know I'm going to run over time. I'm not going to talk about the following projects tonight in detail. Hopefully the images will speak for themselves, tell their own story. I'd prefer to comment on the circumstance and context of some of our work. I'll get used to this. It's a quote from our book, perhaps slightly exaggerated, but nonetheless, it attempts to show where we try and head. We may not achieve that grand notion. Most of our work used to start off with my own blue ideograms. More and more, I'm becoming less autocratic, and democracy has reached our office, so everybody now has a go. All ideas are on the table. Footprints. I like to think of our plans as being a family. They're related, but they're also different. It's like an extended family.
Excuse me, can I ask that the lights be turned off? It's really hard. These are beautiful images, we just can't see.
As long as I can still see. I'll go back.
Volume. I don't know where the lights are.
No idea.
I don't know. Someone else will have to do it. That's only for the sound.
I listened to Will Alsop give a talk a few years ago, and he couldn't get started at all. And so he looked at the audience, and someone said, "Do you need a hand?" He said, "No, I need a brain."
I don't know, sorry.
Well, it seems we can't find one, so we'll have to continue. So it's an extended family. You really can't see them? Hmm? It's these lights here that are the worry. Yeah. Oh, we better press on while we're looking for the light. More of the same. Our plans, which I place a lot of importance on. We spend a lot of time bringing our plans to where we feel they should be. And of course, they then translate into three-dimensional models. And I think that photographing the plans of models, for me, is a very important confirmation of where we're heading. I'm going to start with competitions, not something I normally do, but competitions are about the future. They also rub shoulders with the past. They demand mental agility and clarity of ideas. And I believe it's a vital process for designers in which to engage. Competitions also expand your knowledge of varied and different building types. And if you're lucky, they can become real work. We've found that simply being a part of the process can lead to unexpected outcomes, win or lose. Though at the end of the day, perhaps the most important aspect of the process is the energy level that competitions bring to a practice. In our studio, almost everyone contributes ideas. We all have a go until the final direction is found. In fact, one of our renderers won our internal competition for our submission in Helsinki. In 2008, we participated in an invited competition for the King Abdullah Performing Arts Centre in Jordan. We lost. Zaha won. But the experience of competing against 5 of Europe's top architects was worth every minute of it. A real edginess exists in the European competition system. Architects are often involved in 3 or 4 of competitions at the same time. That's how they procure their work. But there are pitfalls. Avoid in-house judgment. Juries must be independent and professional. Over the past 15 years, we've entered 22 competitions and have been lucky enough to win half of them. However, the disappointment is that only 4 have been built. I thought I'd show this for those of you who mightn't know about it. It was our 2006 or 5 competition for the UNSW campus in Singapore. We took the project right through to piling, when unfortunately it was cancelled. It's now the site of Singapore's 4th university, the Singapore Design and Technology University. Sad. But it was going to be a tropical campus with a big veranda as its central space and courtyards with lots of bamboo. For those of you that might not know, bamboo, while it is growing, retains more carbon and gives off more oxygen than any other plant species on the planet. This makes it an ideal greenhouse sink. So we should have bamboo along all of our highways. Sketches, I keep looking at both of them like they're different. I'm sorry, they're the same. Sketches for the Aboriginal Cultures Museum at the University of Western Australia. The building itself, which we were lucky enough to win. It's quite monolithic, with a centre that's carved out. It's sandstone, like the campus is throughout UWA. Here's the lights. with Core 10 artwork in a way. But we're going to engage with the local Aboriginal members who will, in fact, direct and carry out this process. Now we've got both lights on.
Sorry, it's going to have to.
Technology always gets in the way.
We're gonna...
Thank you. And closer to our office is the big red square in Fremantle, and then the small red square. The big red square is the new City of Fremantle council chambers and library that we're doing. We're hopeful that both this and the previous museum will actually proceed to become buildings. This one also has a great big veranda and a lawn that slopes down to the King's Square. It's part of a mall, quite trafficable. And for the fun of it, this was our entry in the Sydney Modern competition. The idea was, there were two big ideas in it. One was a grand stair that cut through the centre of the site, through there, and the Aboriginal gallery, which was almost standalone. The stairs were bigger, marginally bigger, than the Spanish Steps, and they were designed to be sat on, jogged on, press-upped on, all those things that you see people doing down there, and to have lunch. The Aboriginal gallery, and the subterranean galleries, which engage with the existing tanks on site. We were disappointed, I've got to say, we didn't win this. But what has won it is going to be terrific. And the reason I started with competitions is quite simple. The 4 buildings that we have built out of our winning entries are all in my home city, the city of Perth. And they're in one way or another related. There are 2 sites, Cathedral Square, which you see up on the bottom of the map, and there where the State Theatre Centre is. I need to look over here. Cathedral Square, or the whole city precinct, consists of the Town Hall, what's called the old Treasury Building, a 1970s office block, the cathedral, the Anglican Cathedral, the Playhouse, which was built in the 60s, and the Deanery. So it's probably Perth's most historic centre. We took part in 3 competitions, and luckily for us, we won each one. One was the refurbishment of the Treasury Building, the left-hand side of the screen. One was this doesn't seem to work very well. One is the new City of Perth Library, where the city and the trust, Anglican Trust, agreed to chop half of the office building down to make way for a space for a library. And the other is the new Anglican Trust building. It also included a tall tower, which started off rather more slender. I'll show you what that looks like. The Treasury, Cathedral, Deanery, Library, and the Anglican Trust building. This was made possible, some of this was made possible, by the relocation of the Playhouse to a new home in the State Theatre Centre, a competition we won in 2005. And it's been quite successful. It's not big, it's a 575-seat theatre, plus an underground studio. And we won the competition because of a strategy not to go horizontally, but to put one theatre above the other. And this created space for a third venue that wasn't a part of the brief, and that's a performing courtyard, a almost Shakespearean theatre in proportion. So having built this, it enabled us to demolish the Playhouse, and that opened up the opportunity for the rest of the cathedral precinct to be built. So back to the Treasury and the cathedral precinct. There's a network that we've created of pedestrian links. Our original competition had a much more slender residential tower. Got a bit fatter because it became an office block, which now houses the Justice Department. You can see the library poking its head out on the right-hand side. The Treasury Building was, we call it the old Treasury Building, but it has been built in 12 stages through history. It began in the early 1800s as an army barracks and has subsequently been in about 12 or 13 different stages: a hospital, the Lands Department, the Perth GPO, Legislative Council, the Survey Department, and finally the Treasury, the old Treasury. In fact, all distances in Perth are measured from that corner there, because it was the GPO. You must have one in Sydney somewhere. So our task here was to completely refurbish. It was falling down. It hadn't been used for 20 years when they had a competition to refurbish this, together with the building of the tower. This is how it's looked through history. That's how it looks today. Our client, very enlightened, was prepared to go the full length in the quality of restoration that was required. It cost him a lot of money. George Temple Pool building on the right, quite lovely, almost Renaissance. Details all reinstated. I better hurry up because it's going to take too long to do it all. The floor plan, we did minimal intervention in the interior, used the rooms that existed, and where we needed to. One room became a bathroom, one became a bedroom. Sometimes the bathrooms are bigger than the bedrooms. And sometimes they're very big. It's the old and the new. The postal hall, cafes, important historic staircases, the memory of a lift cage that was, we've reinstated it. Restaurant. And a lot of the interiors have been just stripped back to expose the patina of the building itself. And there are then modern elements placed within that. And a swimming pool. Shot of the Treasury and the library under construction. Tower and an important plaza that is formed around its base. Engagement with the old and the new. The light floods in. And the library. Again, an independent, separate commission. It's a circular building, a soft form against the Treasury, and the intention was to open up the view of the facade of the Land Titles building, which really hadn't been seen since the early 70s. And also, it gives the Land Titles building a much freer view out. So it's a cylinder, but chamfered towards the Cathedral Square, which never got sun since the 1970s either. And took a photo about a week ago. I should have had it in this slideshow on the 1st of June that showed how much sunlight was actually getting on to the grassed area of the square. People were sitting there in deck chairs. So cylindrical, simple, reading room of 3 floors, children's room at the top. It opened about 3 months ago, and whilst our photos won't show people, it actually is packed. We wanted to cover the building next door with a green wall, but the tenant wouldn't allow it. But he gave us a small patch. That's the building next door. Unfolded facade, 3 components. It opens up views of the cathedral, detail. It's clad with Austral Verde granite from Norseman in the southwest of Australia. And this is the quarry. The stone was mined here or quarried here and then taken to Shanghai, where it was cut, honed, fabricated, packed up in lovely little boxes and sent back to be put onto the building. A very high carbon footprint. But that's what's happening in Australia. It was half the price doing it that way. So the palette of materials for the library, stone and timber throughout. The main reading room, without people, but there are lots. And a mural on the ceiling by a young Australian artist, Andrew Nichols. It's based on Shakespeare's last work, The Tempest, the story of Caliban and his helper, who are shipwrecked on a fictitious island. Andrew has placed the island as being Australia, so it's depicting Australian flora and fauna, and it might be difficult to see, but Caliban's young man is sitting, around here. And he had a very big penis in the proposal. So we put up a mock-up, and the Lord Mayor of Perth, who I'm very fond of, had a look at it and said, "Oh no, you've got to take that off." We said, "Why?" She said, "Well, children are coming in here." So he did. He had to paint it out. On the opening night, I was asked to give a few words, and so I said that, we were very happy with the building, but we were disappointed that the genitalia had gone. I was standing beneath it with the Archbishop's wife, and she looked up and she said, "Where is it?" And I said, "No, there, it's gone." And she said, "Why?" So I told her the story, and she said, "Don't children have them?" And this is the children's library. Lots of colour. And then the final bit in our jigsaw puzzle is the church house, shaped to allow eastern light on the cathedral facade, which is the altar, and to open up the facade to public view, again for the first time, in fact since the 60s. This is under construction, we'll be finished in about another 6 months. So now I'll switch. And I'm going to sit down here if you don't mind. To Japan. Can you hear? Can still hear? Okay. Japan, not the sort of project we'd normally do. It's inside somebody else's building, KPF, in the middle of Tokyo. Very big building. It's an office tower with a footprint of 4,700 metres per floor. That's a big space. We were commissioned to do a hotel in the top 6 floors, and luckily we were there from the very beginning, or near the beginning, and were able to space plan everything. This is the entry at the ground level, plan of the upper bedroom floors, and we were able to create the void in the centre of the very large footprint. It's lined with washi paper. Critics have talked about it being a giant lantern. Some have said it's a Japanese garden. It was none of those. It's just a material that is Japanese, and we thought it was a good thing to use. And there are pockets of different functions around it, around the lobby. And a pool that looks south and gets sun all the time and looks at Fuji. Guest rooms, and a bath with a view. Also in Japan, we've just opened this. It's in a place called Shima, which is where the Ise Shrine is. And the small rafts down here are the original culture pearl farms of Mikimoto. They still exist. Our model maker took a long time to make the base of this. And we had a headbutting session with the president of Japan's largest real estate company, Mitsui Fudosan. We wanted to use a timber roof. He wanted to use a traditional tile. And I learnt after one session that you don't argue with the head of Mitsui Fudosan. In fact, I went to Kengo Kuma, my friend, and said, you know, what do you do when you run into a problem like this? And he said, oh, Kerry-san. He said, I would never do a project for Mitsui Fudosan. I said, thanks. Great advice. But we did use a tile, and it's not traditional. It's one that we found, which we think is actually rather beautiful. So we're quite happy with the end result. And the buildings are a box within a box. They have a dark timber exterior and a light wood interior. We designed all the furniture, which was made in a Japanese factory in the Philippines. And the bath again with a view. This is actually onsen water, mineral water. Public areas before completion. The pool. Landscaping is in now, but it happened in winter, so it's been a bit slow. And a courtyard off a library. The spa, which is an onsen, with pools of different temperature. In the winter, you get the steam. An indoor watsu. And different forms are moulded within the pitch roof building form, with a play of light and shadow in the corridors. And braziers at night. And I'd like to talk about this for a minute because it's one of my favourite projects. I've been involved in it for 20 years, which is a long time, but finally we've got it under construction. It's a contemporary ryokan of 25 rooms in Kyoto. It sits on the opposite side of the hill from Kinkokuji, which is the Golden Pavilion. And it consists of 40 acres of land, 32 of which can't be built on, and 8 was developed into a rather beautiful garden. by one of Japan's leading makers of the obi, a man called Asano-san. This is a photo I took at the beginning of winter just over 20 years ago. And his great friend Isamu Noguchi helped him place some of the stones in the garden. Of course, it's designed for different seasons. The great stair there was designed to look like a stair when you're walking up and like a ramp when you're walking down. Bit tricky. But he had a collection of textiles from across history, not just Japanese, but also pre-Columbian, Indonesian, and he intended to build a museum here. Created the garden in the 50s, created the platforms for the museum buildings, and he died in 1956. So the garden sat there, literally locked up until we found it. So we're building just on the platforms that he had created. We're not touching the garden. The buildings are simple, barn-like, in fact minka, which is Japanese country house-like, almost dumb in their simplicity. And the room. Tatami, but with a bed. Even the young Japanese refused to sleep on tatami. And now quite different. We're going to China. We were offered work in China for 5 years or more. And I said no, because of all of the horror stories we'd heard from our colleagues. The details are changed, the materials are substituted, they do it too fast, and you don't get paid. Well, finally we did a project there, and all of those things came true. In one project. But some of it's okay. It's big. It's a hotel, villas, apartments. That's how big it is. Tea room, tea house. And the corridors are all single-loaded, lots of light, naturally ventilated. We did the interiors, Chinese restaurant, the pool, looking back at the city of Qingdao, and the villas separated by precast concrete screens, and wedding chapel. This is where you get married. A very different kind of project and a very sophisticated client. This is just out of Shanghai, about 45 minutes drive. And our client, when he was 28 years old, he came from a village 700 kilometers southeast of Shanghai. Lovely village, there's several of them there. The government didn't acquire, they took the land for a dam project, and in a very enlightened manner, he got permission to take down 53 of the best Ming and Qing dynasty houses in the village, which he did. These are the walkways in the village. That's our client. When he was about 28 to 30, they documented every house. They'd assembled every house. They packed them up and took them to a warehouse just near the site that we're now working on, complete with decorative elements. At the same time, he root balled 4,000 camphorwood trees, some of them 1,000 years old. Gave them a severe haircut, wrapped them up, took them to Shanghai and created a nursery They moved bridges, toll booths to get the trees there. And now we're doing really a small township of 3 phases of a club, residences, quite a lot for arts and retail, and a park of 300 square metres. The government helped him purchase this land in return for providing the park, which is 300 acres, and we have to plant 2,000, roughly 2,000, of his 4,500 trees in the park. He had an 80% survival rate. So this is the footprint of the first stage. It's a mixture of old and new. Two different kinds, one with a contemporary living pavilion, one with an antique house. Our contemporary intervention in this, currently under construction. And we've just started planting the trees a few weeks ago. The rooms based on the Hutong, 2 courtyards. This is the mock-up guest room. And the screens are, they derive from the cloud design. The stone roof, we're testing for leakage. It leaked. The bathroom. A cluster of houses or rooms. And in China, you have to use all of the gross floor area, all of the GFA. You can't underuse it on a site because they say that land is too valuable. The other thing you can do is build basements under the whole lot, which don't count as GFA. So beneath each one of these houses, there are basements of 450 square metres where our clients are putting art galleries, wine cellars, gymnasiums, pools, karaoke rooms, a basement under the old house, one of the first antique houses to be reassembled, interiors. This project will be finished this time next year. They're very dark houses. We're having to find ways of getting light into them through the brickwork. And so we designed a screen that has a bigger aperture on the inside than the outside. Seems to work. Timber was all sanded back. The club, entry. The only place we're not putting camphors, these are Chinese pines. And the lobby. Walkways. And our third project in China, about 2.5 hours in from Shanghai. A place called Anji, in the middle of a very beautiful bamboo forest and tea plantation. We've just started work on this, and we intend to use a lot of bamboo in the buildings. One of the residences spanning the valley. A spa. And now to the Middle East. How are we going for time? Way over. Oh. If anyone feels they have to go and eat, please do. I'll quickly go through them. The Middle East is a very fertile ground for architecture. Of course, we all know it's got its problems, but in tradition, materiality, and culturally, it's a great place to be an architect. It's just a great shame with what's happening to it. This was our first project. 30 courtyard houses. And the suite of 2 rooms. The screens were with Hebron stone, they pivot, and the holes were cut using a high pressure water jet, computerized water jet. This is the Royal Military Academy in Jordan. We tried to give the main body of the project a sense of order. It's a campus, it accommodates 1,500 people, cadets and staff. Our first presentation to the King. But the site does have trees. Jordan has trees. And a cultural centre. We've buried the theatre and designed our first mosque. The mosque and the interior. Sadly, we started work on site, the roads went in, the building platforms were formed, and the Syrian war started, and we now have 600,000 Syrian refugees living about 3 kilometres from our site. So the King has said that he can't be seen to be spending this kind of money when he's got to look after the refugees. They're very good. A similar fate with another project in Jordan. This was near completion. And a project in Qatar, in a very fragile environment. Large, hotel, housing, botanic gardens, souk, the mosque, subterranean spa, beneath a reflection pool, botanic gardens. The desert actually has a lot of flora and fauna. And there is wildlife as well. And in Beirut, again, face to face with history. Very important site alongside Martyrs Square. That's the only remaining structure adjacent to the square from the Civil War. We're keeping that. It's a big project. The Grand Mosque is in front of it. It's a hotel, residential, office. And Beirut, as you all know, is an exciting city, particularly in the evening. Again, a subterranean spa. And a rooftop pool. Delhi, it's not the Middle East, but it's not far off it. And there is a strong Mughal influence in the architecture of India. In this case, we used the column as the base for the architecture and a series of screens, or jalis, that were made of GRC, long forgotten material in Australia. You used to make boats out of them here until fiberglass replaced it. But in India, the industry is alive and well. Bhutan, and I've got about halfway through. 5 lodges across the country. That's my first visit at the bottom. Those peaks in Tibet are 60 kilometres away from where I was standing. There is no pollution there. The buildings are of only 2 kinds, either zongs that were built in the 14th century, they're monasteries, or farmhouses built by the inhabitants themselves. We did 5 lodges across the country. The architecture, traditional architecture, is either very simple or very decorative. Ours tended on the monastic side. We had an argument with the government because of this. I got told off by the Prime Minister, which is not a very comfortable feeling. But now he claims that they were all his idea, and this is the new model for Bhutan. The entrance to one of the lodges Those dead bushes are only dry at the moment because it's winter. They're actually marijuana plants. And we've left them there. We tried to convince our client to call the lodge Amanganja. He wouldn't do it. Composite of stone, timber, the bedrooms with almost combined bathrooms and pot-bellied stoves, also made in Bhutan. The next lodge. This one of stone, whitewashed. Another. Here, it included the restoration of a very fine old farmhouse. So we placed the new buildings in rammed earth, stabilised earth. What used to be the animal shelter. Otherwise, our intervention was simply to furnish it and to clean it up. Spa. This overlooks a great valley. It's a glacial valley. And it's the home to the Siberian black-necked cranes in the middle of winter. They all come down here to nest. They have a wingspan of about 2 meters. And you can see the monastery on the opposite hill. The birds arrive, and in the proper Buddhist manner, they do two clockwise laps around the monastery before they land. And another that engaged with an existing palace and monastery. There is a story to tell about the rammed earth. I don't know if I can tell it in this time, but I sat on a flight to Bhutan alongside a lama. He was the head of the archives, National Archives. He said to me, "What are you doing?" "Going to Bhutan." I said, "Well, so you're having a holiday?" I said, no, I'm an architect. I'm doing some work up there." And he said, "Oh." He said, "Are you doing those very lovely earth walls?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, do you have to use those mechanical rammers?" And I said, "I don't know, I think so." He said, "Well, that's no good for Bhutan, because in Bhutan, the rammed earth houses are built by the women on a holiday, and they chant. And that's how Bhutanese folklore is perpetuated." So I felt very uneasy, got off the plane, rang a man called Giles Honan in southwestern Australia, who had developed the technology there, and I said, "Giles, can you do it with your feet?" And he said, "Sure, but it would cost you a bomb." So anyway, we ended up sending, our client did, with us, 3 Bhutanese contractors down to Margaret River to learn how to do stabilised earth, which is earthquake resistant, it's not earthquake proof. And they took the technology back to Bhutan so that you had a material connection but a transfer of technology. And that's now become a mandatory material in the building of schools, because in earthquakes they'd had some very major collapses from schools made of rammed mud. So that's now the material that the government dictates. And we're getting towards the end. This is Singapore. And you can see what it says. Our idea is not to exclude the sun and the tropics, but to invite it in through a series of filters. We had a lot of gloomy days in Singapore. It's a block of apartments. And the trick in Singapore is that you design from the top down. You have a height limit which you can't exceed, but you have a GFA and a site coverage. And for some funny reason, you can't actually use all of that and get to the top. Or if you do use it, you can't get to the top. If you start at the top and go down, you end up with a big space at the bottom. So this becomes a void. We turned it into the lobby, in fact 2 lobbies, naturally ventilated. They're 15 metres high. And the other thing is that you get breezes above 4 floors in Singapore, most nights. They're naturally ventilated. We don't get strong winds in Singapore. Upformed concrete. This is a 1-bedroom studio, and that big lump in the middle is what's called the household shelter. or we call it the bomb shelter. Every residence in Singapore has to have one. Most of them get used as wine cellars, storage of all kinds. And every building now in the urban areas of Singapore have to have what's called a 5-foot way. The 5-foot way is what you see with shop houses. They keep the rain off you, they connect buildings, and now all modern buildings or current buildings have to provide a similar covered way. Small house in Singapore, same principles, different materials, small confined block, louvered walls that open up, and we're getting to the end of it. I wanted to show this because it's Sri Lanka, which is one of my favourite countries. We've just been commissioned by the government to assist them in developing a brief to rejuvenate 16 acres in the heart of Kandy, which is the second largest city in Sri Lanka. The centre of this is what's called the Bogambara Prison. It's built in 1870. And like most prisons, it's a couple of wings with a large atrium. But Kandy is a cultural city, but there's very little to do there apart from see the Temple of the Tooth and the Botanic Gardens. You can do it in one day. So the idea is to try and keep people there for a bit longer. So we did a study with the government. We looked at various functions, multi-use. We have completed the master plan, which of course will be fluid for some time, and they will find funding through different avenues. It's a big building, but it has some beautiful spaces internally. Some of our ideas, what might go in there. It's a mixture of youth hostel, cultural activities, IT, educational spaces, a culinary school, a small performing arts centre, retail, galleries. I could go on. So these were some of the suggestions. We thought we'd build our library there too. And the plan. Typical of these old prisons with a void down the centre, single-loaded corridors. But the site extends beyond that, out to the hillside as well. This is the plan that the government has now accepted, and we're working on developing it. But we know that this is going to take a long time. It's going to change. It'll morph into something slightly different. But we're at least at a starting point. It's a people place. The buildings on the hill are likely to become very flexible office space with an IT school there as well. Small offices for start-up companies, rentable office for Colombo-based companies. And of course, the evening, where you can show movies. And finally, the last project, also in Sri Lanka, and centred around an old building. This is centred around an old planter's house, which was built in 1820. And in the last, or since 1992, when this was renovated, since then, all of these pavilions have emerged. This house is more about the space between the buildings than the buildings themselves. The old building, albeit renovated, and the roof was lifted by 1 metre. And it rains like mad in Sri Lanka, a bit like Sydney on a Saturday and Sunday. The entrance, As I say, the space between the buildings is as important as the buildings themselves. There are a series of platforms for living. Guest room. You also have to build, or try to build cheaply in a place like Sri Lanka. So a lot of, for instance, the blocks here, they're from the local marketplace. They cost about 150 rupees each. We made them load bearing by putting steel rods in every alternate block. Well, the course. The black pavilion. Living room on top, bedrooms underneath. Polished cement. Economic in Sri Lanka, it's elbow grease that does all of that. The living room. It's a garden room. And ficus has gradually covered all of the walls. And it's a great place to have an office dinner. Some of you might know the man sitting in this corner here. He works with me, he's from Sydney, David Gouty. And Terry Fripp. So I could go through them all and name them. Thank you very much.